It was a perfect day, the kind of day every couple dreams of when imagining their wedding. The sun had dipped just enough to give the sky a soft golden glow, and the gentle hum of string lights added an intimate warmth to the backyard. Friends and family filled the air with laughter and love, dressed in their finest, ready to witness a union that had been years in the making. The bride, radiant in her white gown, and the groom, dashing in his navy suit, stood at the heart of it all, the hands tightly clasped as they prepared to say, "I do." But just beyond the pristine white chairs and carefully arranged floral displays, a storm was brewing. Across the street, peering through her curtained window, was someone who didn't share the joy or excitement of the day. Mrs. Harper, the neighborhood's self-appointed watchdog, had always been quick to judge and quicker to act. She wasn't one for unnecessary noise, as she often put it, and in her eyes, this wedding was not only an inconvenience, but a disruption of her precious peace. Mrs. Harper wasn't just annoyed, she was furious. The guests arriving in elegant cars, the cheerful chatter, and the soft strains of classical music drifting through the air all grated on her nerves. To her, it wasn't just a wedding, it was an invasion. She muttered under her breath, pacing in her living room, convinced there had to be rules against this sort of thing. Then came the moment that would set everything in motion. As she watched from her window, her eyes narrowed at the sight of the couple walking down the makeshift aisle. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. "This is unacceptable," she whispered, dialing 911 with a determined glare. 911, "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher answered calmly. Mrs. Harper didn't hesitate. "There's some sort of unauthorized gathering happening at my neighbor's house. It's loud, disruptive, and frankly suspicious. There are so many people. It's out of control," she said, exaggerating every detail as if she were describing chaos instead of celebration. The dispatcher assured her that officers would be sent to investigate, and Mrs. Harper hung up with a satisfied smirk. She watched from her window, her heart racing with a mix of vindication and anticipation. She had no idea that what was about to unfold would leave her, and everyone else, in stunned silence. Back at the wedding, the atmosphere was pure magic. The vows were being exchanged, the couple's voices trembling with emotion as they promised to love and cherish one another forever. The guests leaned forward, hanging on every word, wiping away tears of joy. The couple had worked so hard to make this day special, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had supported them along the way. Then came the sound no one expected: sirens. Heads turned as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the serene scene. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by murmurs of confusion and concern. The bride and groom exchanged worried glances, their hands still clasped tightly together. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what was happening. The police cars pulled up along the curb, and 4 officers stepped out, their faces a mix of professionalism and uncertainty. As they approached the backyard, the crowd parted, making way for them to speak to the hosts of the event. The officers' presence was intimidating, their uniforms stark against the festive backdrop. One officer stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "We've received a complaint about this gathering. Can we speak to the property owner?" The groom's father stepped forward, his expression calm but confused. "This is my home," he said, his voice steady. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Before the officer could respond, Mrs. Harper appeared at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed and her face smug. She called out loudly, ensuring everyone could hear her. "I told you this was out of control. This is a quiet neighborhood, and we don't need this kind of disturbance." Gasps rippled through the crowd as guests exchanged incredulous looks. The couple stood frozen, the bride's hand tightening around the groom's arm. But instead of panic, there was something else in their eyes, a quiet, unshakable strength. The officer, sensing the tension in the air, turned to address Mrs. Harper briefly before looking back at the couple and their guests. "Let's get this sorted out," he said, his tone professional but curious. What happened next would not only shock the officers, but also leave Mrs. Harper questioning everything she thought she knew. Because the bride and groom weren't just any couple. Their identity would turn this tense moment into one that no one present would ever forget. The crowd stood silent, the soft hum of the police car engines filling the uneasy pause. All eyes were on the officers now, their expressions carefully neutral as they scanned the scene. The officer who seemed to be in charge glanced from the groom's father to the bride and groom, his brow furrowing slightly. Something wasn't adding up. This didn't look like the kind of scene that usually warranted police intervention. The bride, still holding onto her groom, took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent months planning every detail of this wedding, from the invitations to the smallest flower arrangement. This day was supposed to be about love, joy, and celebration. The last thing she expected was to see flashing lights and hear accusations from an angry neighbor. "I'm sorry, officers," she began, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "Is there a problem?" The lead officer met her gaze, his voice calm. "We received a complaint about a loud gathering. We're just here to make sure everything is in order." Before the bride could respond, Mrs. Harper interjected, stepping closer with a triumphant smirk. "It's not just the noise," she said sharply. "There are far too many people here. It's a nuisance. And I don't know what kind of activity is going on, but it doesn't feel right for this neighborhood." The bride turned to face the woman, her jaw tightening. She had run-ins with Mrs. Harper before. The woman was known for her complaints, whether it was about someone's lawn being too overgrown or a child riding their bike too close to her driveway. But this felt personal. The groom, ever the calm presence, placed a reassuring hand on his wife's shoulder before addressing the officers. "We're celebrating our wedding," he said simply, his voice measured. "We've done everything by the book. Permits, noise levels, parking. Everything is in order." The lead officer nodded, sensing the sincerity in the groom's words. "Do you mind if we take a look around, just to confirm?" The groom nodded. "Of course. You're welcome to check whatever you need." As the officers began walking around the property, Mrs. Harper lingered at the edge of the lawn, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes darted from guest to guest, her expression growing darker by the moment. She had been so certain she was doing the right thing, but the composed responses of the bride and groom were throwing her off balance. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Inside the tent, the tension was palpable. Guests whispered to one another, their voices hushed but urgent. Some glanced at the couple with concern, while others stared at Mrs. Harper with barely concealed frustration. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a reunion of family and friends, many of whom hadn't seen each other in years. And now the joyful occasion was overshadowed by the neighbor's intrusion. One of the bridesmaids, a childhood friend of the bride, stepped closer to her. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The bride nodded, though her hands were trembling. "I'm fine," she said, though the crack in her voice betrayed her. I don't understand why she's doing this." The bridesmaid's gaze hardened as she glanced toward Mrs. Harper. "She's miserable, that's why, and she can't stand to see anyone else happy." Meanwhile, the officers were making their way through the backyard, checking the setup. They inspected the sound system, glanced at the seating arrangements, and even peeked into the catering area. Everything was exactly as the groom had said, well organized and respectful of the neighborhood. The lead officer stopped near the dessert table, where a young boy was helping himself to a second slice of cake. The boy looked up, startled, his face covered in frosting. The officer couldn't help but smile. "Looks like everything's under control here," he said to one of his colleagues. As they returned to the front of the property, the groom's father was waiting for them. "Find anything out of the ordinary?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. The lead officer shook his head. "No, sir. Everything seems to be in order. You've done a great job keeping things organized." The father nodded, a small smile of relief playing on his lips. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate you taking the time to check. But as the officers prepared to leave, something caught the lead officer's attention. It was a subtle shift in the mood of the crowd, a mixture of anticipation and unease. He looked back at the couple, standing hand in hand, their heads held high despite the weight of the moment. There was something about them, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Before we go," he said, turning to the bride and groom, "can I ask your names?" The couple exchanged a glance, a flicker of hesitation passing between them. Then the groom stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Jonathan Reed," he said, "and this is my wife, Dr. Amelia Reed." The lead officer's eyes widened slightly at the title. "Doctor," he repeated, glancing at the bride. "Yes," Amelia said, her voice calm. "I'm a surgeon at the downtown hospital." The officer nodded slowly, the pieces starting to fall into place. But before he could say anything further, Mrs. Harper let out a scoff from the sidelines. "Doctor or not, that doesn't excuse disrupting the peace," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Amelia turned to face the woman, her expression a mixture of hurt and resolve. "Mrs. Harper," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I understand that you might not like the noise or the crowd, but this is our wedding day, a day we've waited years for. We've done everything we can to respect the neighborhood, and I'm sorry if you feel inconvenienced, but we're not doing anything wrong." For a moment, Mrs. Harper faltered, her lips pressing into a thin line. But she quickly regained her composure, her voice sharp. "You people think you can just—" "Mrs. Harper," the lead officer interrupted, his voice firm but measured, "I think we've seen enough here. This event is well within the law. There's no reason for us to take any further action." The woman opened her mouth to argue, but the officer held up a hand. "If you have any further concerns, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. But for now, I suggest we let these people enjoy their evening." Mrs. Harper's face flushed with anger, but she didn't say another word. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. As the officers prepared to leave, the lead officer paused, turning back to the couple. "Congratulations on your wedding," he said, a small smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "And thank you for your patience." Jonathan and Amelia nodded, their gratitude evident. "Thank you," Jonathan said. "We appreciate it." But even as the officers returned to their cars, the unease lingered. There was more to this story, more than the guests, the officers, or even Mrs. Harper could have imagined. And soon the truth would come to light, leaving everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. As the police cars disappeared down the street, the festive hum of the wedding returned, but the tension lingered like a shadow over the celebration. Guests tried to shake off the unease, raising their glasses in toasts and offering warm smiles to the couple, but the interruption had left a mark. Jonathan and Amelia stayed close together, their hands intertwined, silently drawing strength from each other. Amelia glanced toward Mrs. Harper's house. The curtains were drawn tightly, but she could feel the weight of the woman's gaze from behind the glass. It wasn't the first time Mrs. Harper had made her presence known in unpleasant ways. Over the past year, her comments and actions had grown increasingly intrusive, though they always stopped just short of outright harassment. Amelia wondered if tonight's events were a culmination of something deeper, something more personal. As the evening wore on, the couple made their way through the crowd, thanking guests for coming and reassuring everyone that everything was fine. But the smiles they wore were strained, and their laughter felt heavier than before. At one table, Amelia's childhood friend, Sophia, leaned in close, her voice low. "I still can't believe that woman," she said, shaking her head. "It's like she's got some kind of vendetta against you two." Jonathan sighed, his jaw tightening. "It's not just us," he said. "She's been like this with a lot of people in the neighborhood, complaining about kids playing, calling the HOA for the smallest things. But tonight, this felt different." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think it's because of who you are?" Amelia frowned. "What do you mean?" Sophia hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "You're a successful black couple in a neighborhood that isn't exactly known for being diverse," she said quietly. "You've worked so hard to build this life, and maybe some people resent that." The words hung in the air, unspoken truths that everyone at the table understood but didn't want to say out loud. Jonathan's expression darkened, and Amelia felt a pang of sadness mixed with frustration. She had worked tirelessly to achieve her dreams, facing countless challenges along the way. This was supposed to be a moment of celebration, not a reminder of the biases they still had to navigate. Meanwhile, across the street, Mrs. Harper paced her living room, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about the wedding had been wrong, though she couldn't quite articulate what it was. To her, the couple's calm demeanor and polished responses only made her more suspicious. They were too composed, too perfect. There had to be something they were hiding, she thought. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop, scrolling through local community forums. She began typing a post, carefully choosing her words to make her complaint seem justified. "Unruly gathering disrupts neighborhood peace," she wrote. "Large crowd, loud music, and questionable activity. Is this what we've come to?" But as she hovered over the post button, she hesitated. Deep down, she knew the wedding had been nothing more than a celebration of love. There was no real threat, no crime, no chaos. Still, the bitterness in her heart refused to let her see the joy for what it was. Back at the wedding, the night had taken on a quieter, more reflective tone. The laughter and dancing continued, but the earlier interruption had shifted the mood. Amelia found herself sitting alone at a table, staring out at the twinkling lights. She felt Jonathan's hand on her shoulder and looked up to see him watching her with concern. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her eyes betrayed her. "I just keep thinking, why? Why does she hate us so much?" Jonathan sat down beside her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know if it's hate," he said after a moment. "Maybe it's fear. Fear of change, fear of losing control. People like her, they hold on to what they know, even if it's at the expense of others." Amelia sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I just wish we didn't have to deal with this on our wedding day." Jonathan kissed the top of her head. "We'll get through it," he said. "We always do." Unbeknownst to the couple, the night's events were far from over. While the wedding wound down, Mrs. Harper's post had begun to gain traction online, attracting a mix of supportive comments and sharp criticism. Some neighbors defended the couple, praising their kindness and integrity. Others, emboldened by anonymity, echoed Mrs. Harper's complaints, spinning stories of imagined transgressions. As the comments piled up, one in particular caught Mrs. Harper's attention. It was from a neighbor she hadn't spoken to in years, a retired teacher named Mr. Caldwell. His message was short but pointed. "Before casting judgment, maybe take the time to get to know them. You might be surprised by what you find." The words gnawed at Mrs. Harper, though she wouldn't admit it. She closed her laptop with a frustrated sigh, retreating to her bedroom. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the lingering doubt. Had she been wrong? Back at the wedding, the last few guests were saying their goodbyes. Amelia and Jonathan stood by the door, thanking everyone for coming and accepting hugs and congratulations. The love and support from their friends and family were a balm to the day's tension, but as the final car pulled away, the silence that followed felt heavy. They walked back into the now empty backyard, the twinkling lights casting a soft glow over the space. Jonathan took Amelia's hand, pulling her into a slow dance under the stars. For a moment, it was just the two of them, their love stronger than any obstacle. But in the back of their minds, they knew this wasn't the end. The events of the day had opened a door to something deeper, something unresolved. And as they held each other close, they couldn't help but wonder, what would tomorrow bring? The next morning, the sun rose over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. But for Jonathan and Amelia, the events of the previous night were far from over. As they sipped their coffee in the kitchen, the phone buzzed with notifications, messages from friends, links to posts, and snippets of gossip that had made its way online. It didn't take long for them to realize that their wedding had become the center of an unexpected storm. Jonathan scrolled through the community forum, his brow furrowed. "Look at this," he said, turning the phone toward Amelia. She leaned in and read the post Mrs. Harper had written, her chest tightening with each word. "Unruly gathering," Amelia repeated, her voice rising. "She's making it sound like we threw some wild party. This was our wedding." Jonathan nodded, his jaw clenched. "And now people are piling on, making up stories about what happened." Amelia's eyes filled with frustration. Why does she care so much about what we're doing? We weren't bothering anyone. Jonathan set the phone down, taking a deep breath. "It's not about us, Amelia. It's about control. She's trying to paint us as the problem, but we're not going to let her win." Across the street, Mrs. Harper sat on her porch, watching as neighbors walked by. Some glanced in her direction, their expressions unreadable, while others avoided her gaze altogether. She felt a flicker of uncertainty, wondering if she had gone too far. But the post had already taken on a life of its own, and she convinced herself that she had been justified in speaking out. By midday, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Neighbors whispered to each other as they passed, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. For some, it was a chance to gossip. For others, it was a reminder of the deeper issues that simmered beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic community. Jonathan and Amelia decided they couldn't ignore what was happening. They needed to address it head-on. With determined expressions, they crafted a thoughtful response to Mrs. Harper's post, calmly explaining the purpose of the gathering and emphasizing their respect for the neighborhood. They chose their words carefully, aiming to disarm any hostility with grace and honesty. "We are so grateful to our friends and family who joined us to celebrate our marriage," they wrote. "It was a day filled with love and joy, and we took every precaution to ensure we were respectful of our neighbors. We hope that any concerns can be addressed through open dialogue rather than assumptions or misunderstandings." The post quickly garnered attention, with many neighbors chiming in to express their support for the couple. Messages of encouragement poured in, with people praising Jonathan and Amelia's composure and integrity. But not everyone was convinced. Mrs. Harper read their response with a sinking feeling. She had expected outrage, anger, or defensiveness, but instead, they had met her accusations with kindness. It made her feel exposed, as though her actions were being held up to a mirror she didn't want to look into. As the day went on, tensions continued to build. A small group of neighbors decided to hold an impromptu meeting at the local park, hoping to address the growing divide. Jonathan and Amelia were invited, and though they hesitated at first, they knew it was important to be part of the conversation. When they arrived, a small crowd had already gathered, including Mrs. Harper, who stood off to the side with her arms crossed. Jonathan and Amelia exchanged a glance, silently bracing themselves for whatever was to come. The meeting began with a few neighbors voicing their thoughts. Some expressed frustration at the negativity that had taken root in the community, while others shared stories of how the couple had been nothing but kind and generous since moving in. Slowly, the conversation shifted toward Mrs. Harper, who remained silent but visibly uncomfortable. Finally, Jonathan spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "We moved into this neighborhood because we believed it was a place where we could build a life, where we could be part of a community. Last night was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives, but instead, it became something else entirely. We're not here to create division. We're here to build connections." Amelia stepped forward, her voice filled with emotion. "We understand that change can be hard and that misunderstandings happen, but we can't keep living in a place where we're made to feel like we don't belong. We hope that this can be a turning point, a chance for all of us to move forward together." The crowd murmured in agreement, their expressions softening. Even Mrs. Harper seemed taken aback by the sincerity of their words. For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to ease, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved. As the meeting wrapped up, Jonathan and Amelia walked home, their hearts heavy but hopeful. They knew they had done everything they could to stand up for themselves without compromising their values. but they couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. That night, as the neighborhood fell silent, Mrs. Harper sat alone in her living room, staring at the empty street outside. The words she had heard at the meeting echoed in her mind, challenging the beliefs she had held onto for so long. She felt a knot of uncertainty in her chest, torn between her pride and the growing realization that she might have been wrong. For Jonathan and Amelia, the night brought restless sleep, their dreams filled with fragments of the day's events. They didn't know what the future held, but they were determined to face it together. The conflict that had begun with a single call to the police was now something much larger, a test of resilience, compassion, and the strength of their love. As dawn broke, the neighborhood stirred once more, unaware that the climax of the story was fast approaching. The unresolved tension hung in the air, waiting for the moment when everything would come to a head. The morning arrived heavy with an unspoken tension, the kind that lingered in the air long after the storm clouds had passed. Jonathan and Amelia sat in their kitchen, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm as their minds raced with unanswered questions. They had expected the community meeting to ease some of the tension, but instead, it had left them more unsettled. The words they had spoken the night before were honest, heartfelt, but they knew that not everyone had been convinced. Their phones buzzed almost in unison, pulling them out of their thoughts. Jonathan picked his up and froze. It was a message from a neighbor, someone they barely knew, accompanied by a screenshot of a new post on the community forum. Amelia leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the text. The post wasn't from Mrs. Harper this time. It was from an anonymous account, and it didn't just criticize the wedding. It made personal accusations about Jonathan and Amelia, painting them as deceitful and self-serving. The words were sharp, filled with venom, and aimed to turn the neighborhood against them. How could someone do this? Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. This is personal. They're attacking our character. Jonathan's hand tightened around his phone. This isn't just about the wedding anymore, he said, his voice low. Someone's trying to smear us, to make us out to be something we're not. The post quickly gained traction, with comments pouring in. Some defended the couple, sharing stories of their kindness and generosity, while others piled on, feeding into the narrative the anonymous poster had crafted. The division in the neighborhood grew sharper, the lines drawn deeper. Amelia's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her brother Marcus. "Have you seen the post?" he asked, his voice tense. "We just did," she replied, her heart sinking. "There's more to it," Marcus said. "I've been digging around, and I think I know who's behind it. It's not just Mrs. Harper." Amelia's breath caught. "Who is it?" "I'll explain when I get there," Marcus said. "Just be careful." When Marcus arrived an hour later, his expression was grim. He placed his laptop on the dining table and pulled up a series of screenshots and messages. "There's a group of people in the neighborhood who've been talking about you two for months," he explained. "It's not just about the wedding. It's about who you are, your success, your presence here. Some of them see it as a threat." Amelia stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. The messages were filled with coded language and subtle digs, but the intent was clear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a one-off incident. It was a coordinated effort to make them feel unwelcome. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "And Mrs. Harper?" he asked. "She's part of it," Marcus confirmed. "But she's not the ringleader. Someone else has been stirring the pot, pushing people to act." Amelia leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. Why? Why go to so much trouble to tear us down? Marcus shrugged, his expression pained. "Sometimes people can't handle seeing others succeed. They see you living the life they wish they had, and instead of being happy for you, they try to tear you down." As the weight of Marcus's words settled over them, Jonathan and Amelia realized the stakes were higher than they had thought. This wasn't just about their wedding or a nosy neighbor. It was about their right to exist in a space that others wanted to claim as their own. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan and Amelia sat together on their porch, their hands intertwined. The neighborhood was quiet, but it felt like the calm before the storm. "What do we do now?" Amelia asked softly. Jonathan looked out at the street, his expression resolute. "We fight back," he said, "not with anger or bitterness, but with the truth. We've worked too hard to let anyone take this away from us." Amelia nodded, drawing strength from his words. "We'll show them who we are," she said. "Not who they think we are, but the truth." The couple spent the next few days gathering their thoughts, reaching out to neighbors they trusted, and crafting a plan to address the growing tension. They knew they couldn't change everyone's mind, but they could shine a light on the truth and refuse to let the negativity define them. Meanwhile, across the street, Mrs. Harper watched from her window, her mind torn between loyalty to the group she had aligned herself with and the growing doubt that gnawed at her conscience. She had always prided herself on standing firm in her beliefs, but now, for the first time, she began to wonder if she had been wrong. The anonymous poster, emboldened by the attention their words had garnered, began to escalate their efforts. They dug into Jonathan and Amelia's past, searching for anything they could use to discredit them. But what they found only complicated matters, revealing truths that would soon upend everything the neighborhood thought it knew. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing day, the lines between allies and adversaries blurring. As Jonathan and Amelia prepared to confront the growing storm, they knew the battle ahead would test not only their resilience, but also the strength of the community itself. The truth was coming to light, and with it, a reckoning that no one could avoid. The day of the neighborhood meeting arrived, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Jonathan and Amelia had spent the last few days preparing for this moment, determined to address the accusations head-on and reclaim their sense of belonging. They weren't just speaking for themselves anymore. They were standing up for the truth, for fairness, and for the kind of community they believed this neighborhood could be. Neighbors filled the community's center, their faces a mixture of curiosity, tension, and unease. Mrs. Harper sat near the front, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. Jonathan and Amelia entered the room hand in hand, their heads held high despite the weight of the past weeks. Marcus followed closely behind, carrying the evidence they gathered to expose the deeper truth. As the meeting began, the moderator opened the floor for discussion. A few neighbors stood to voice their frustrations, but their arguments were thin, rooted more in whispers and assumptions than in reality. Then Jonathan stepped forward, his voice steady but impassioned. "For weeks, my wife and I have been subjected to rumors and attacks on our character," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "All because we dared to celebrate our love in the home we've worked so hard to build. We've been accused, judged, and targeted, not because we've done anything wrong, but because some people can't accept that we belong here." Amelia stepped up beside him, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We've always believed in treating our neighbors with kindness and respect. That's why this has been so painful. But we've also learned that silence only allows lies to grow. So today, we're here to share the truth." With Marcus's help, they presented their findings, screenshots of the anonymous messages, evidence of the coordinated effort to undermine them, and even records disproving some of the accusations that had been made. The room fell silent as the weight of the evidence sank in. People began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, realizing the extent of the manipulation. Then Marcus dropped the final bombshell. "We traced the anonymous account," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "And we know who's behind it." All eyes turned toward Mrs. Harper, who sat frozen in her chair. But Marcus's gaze didn't land on her. Instead, he turned to a man sitting a few rows behind her, a man who had remained quiet throughout the meeting. It was Mr. Gregson, a longtime resident known for his outspoken views. Jonathan and Amelia exchanged a stunned look. They had suspected Mrs. Harper all along, but now it was clear that she had been a pawn in a larger game. Mr. Gregson shifted uncomfortably as murmurs spread through the room. "You've been stirring the pot, haven't you, Mr. Gregson?" Marcus said, his tone sharp but controlled. "Using others to do your dirty work, hiding behind anonymity while you try to drive us off." Mr. Gregson stood abruptly, his face flushed. I was only trying to protect the neighborhood, he snapped. People like them don't understand what this community is about. Jonathan's voice cut through the tension. People like us, he said, his tone firm but calm. What exactly does that mean, Mr. Gregson? Hardworking, loving, determined, because that's who we are, and we're not going anywhere. The room erupted in chatter, neighbors turning to one another with questions and outrage. Mrs. Harper sat silently, her expression shifting from shock to something resembling guilt. For the first time, she seemed to see the harm her actions had caused. As the meeting wound down, neighbors began to approach Jonathan and Amelia, offering apologies and words of support. Some admitted they had been swayed by the rumors and regretted not speaking up sooner. Mrs. Harper stood hesitantly near the door, as if debating whether to leave or stay. Finally, she approached the couple, her face lined with regret. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I see now that I was wrong." Jonathan and Amelia exchanged a glance before Jonathan nodded. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said. "We just want this neighborhood to be a place where everyone feels welcome." As they left the meeting, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. The conflict had been resolved, but the journey had revealed deeper truths about resilience, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. Yet, just as they reached their front porch, Amelia's phone buzzed with a message. She frowned, opening the text. It was from an unknown number, and it read, "You may have won this time, but this isn't over." Jonathan glanced over her shoulder, his expression hardening. "Let them try," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "We're ready for whatever comes next." As the couple stepped inside, the porch light cast their shadows long against the pavement, a quiet testament to their strength. The battle might not have been completely over, but they had learned one thing. They were stronger together, and no one could take that away from them. In the days following the neighborhood meeting, life began to settle back into a fragile kind of normal for Jonathan and Amelia. Though the scars from the conflict lingered, there was a newfound sense of peace in knowing they had stood their ground and revealed the truth. The community itself had shifted, some for the better, and others still struggling to come to terms with what had unfolded. Neighbors who had once been distant began stopping by to offer their support. A couple from down the street brought over a basket of fresh-baked cookies, apologizing for not standing up for them sooner. Others waved warmly as they passed, small gestures that felt monumental after weeks of tension. It was clear that many had been swayed by the lies, but were now eager to make amends. Mrs. Harper, however, remained a complicated figure in the aftermath. While she no longer glared from her porch or muttered sharp remarks in passing, she kept her distance. One morning, as Jonathan was watering the flowers in their front yard, she cautiously approached. "I wanted to say, thank you," she said, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it, "for giving me a chance to do better. I know I've caused harm, and I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I hope I can prove myself over time." Jonathan paused, then nodded. "It's not about proving yourself to us," he said. "It's about reflecting on what kind of neighbor, what kind of person you want to be. If you're willing to grow, then we'll meet you halfway." Her face softened, and for the first time, she offered a small, genuine smile. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Marcus had become something of a hero in the neighborhood for his investigative work. Though he downplayed his role, neighbors frequently stopped to thank him for helping to expose the truth. He had a knack for cutting through the noise and getting to the heart of things, and his presence had been a beacon of support for Jonathan and Amelia. But the anonymous text Amelia had received lingered in the back of their minds. Who had sent it, and why? For weeks, it remained a mystery. They tightened their security, keeping a closer eye on their surroundings, but no further messages came. It was as if the sender had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a thread of unease that neither Jonathan nor Amelia could completely shake. As time passed, the couple turned their focus back to their lives, their work, and their home. They began planning smaller community events, inviting neighbors over for barbecues and game nights. These gatherings became a way to rebuild trust and connection, not just for themselves, but for everyone in the neighborhood. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, they hosted a dinner in their backyard, stringing up the same lights that had illuminated their wedding. The atmosphere was warm and lively, with laughter ringing out as kids played on the lawn and adults chatted over plates of food. It was a stark contrast to the tension that had once filled the same space. Mrs. Harper attended, albeit hesitantly. She stayed near the edges of the gathering, watching more than participating, but it was a significant step nonetheless. Jonathan and Amelia made a point to include her in conversations, gently nudging her out of her shell. By the end of the evening, she had shared a laugh with a few neighbors and even complimented the dessert table. As the night wound down, Jonathan and Amelia stood together, taking in the scene. "This is what we wanted all along," Amelia said, her voice filled with quiet contentment. Jonathan nodded, his arm draped around her shoulders. "It took a lot to get here, but it was worth it. This is home." The weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood slowly began to heal. The incident with Mr. Gregson had left a mark, but it had also sparked important conversations about inclusion, respect, and the kind of community everyone wanted to create. Some neighbors who had been silent before became more vocal in supporting unity, while others quietly faded into the background, their objections no longer holding weight. One afternoon, while Jonathan was working in the garage, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Marcus stepped out, holding a small envelope in his hand. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his tone serious. Amelia joined them as Jonathan opened the envelope. Inside was a typed letter, unsigned, but the words sent a chill through them both. "I underestimated you," he began. "But know this, not everyone in this neighborhood is on your side. Watch your back." Jonathan's grip on the letter tightened. "Who could this be?" he asked, his voice filled with frustration. Marcus shook his head. "It's hard to say, but the fact that they're staying anonymous means they're scared, and that gives you the upper hand." Amelia took the letter, her expression calm but resolute. "We've dealt with worse," she said. "If they think this will scare us off, they're wrong." The letter became a reminder of the challenges they had faced and the strength they had found within themselves. It wasn't the ending they had hoped for, but it was a testament to their resilience. They decided to keep moving forward, choosing connection over fear and truth over intimidation. In the end, the story of Jonathan and Amelia wasn't just about a wedding, a nosy neighbor, or even the anonymous threats. It was about the power of standing up for what's right, the courage to face adversity, and the belief that love, whether between two people or within a community, can overcome even the deepest divisions. As the seasons changed and the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, Jonathan and Amelia continued to open their home and their hearts to those around them. Their story became a quiet legend, a reminder that even in the face of conflict, hope and determination could pave the way for something better. And as they sat together on their porch one evening, watching the sun set over their little corner of the world, they knew they had created more than a home. They had built a foundation of love, trust, and resilience that no storm could ever wash away.